All right, good luck, team.
Okay, Monica, are you ready?
Ready?
Who's going to be on camera first?
I am.
Okay, perfect. All right, we are going live in 5, 4, 3.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. My name is Monica Nepomuceno, and I'm an education programs consultant at the California Department of Education. And so on behalf of the CDE, I just really wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, Suicide Prevention 101 for Parents, Recognizing Signs and What to Do. Just for clarification purposes, this is a repeat of the webinar that we held in December. So you are welcome to stay and try and get more information. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware that we're not presenting any new information. That said, I just want to remind everyone that the CDE is truly committed to reducing and eliminating suicides. We are committed to providing resources, supports, and information so that we can address the increasing mental health needs of students, of families, and of staff. We're always actively searching for the most current information so that we're able to share it with the field, with the parents, caregivers, and also with students. And we know that, this has been a very difficult time. The struggles that have been brought on by COVID-19 have affected us on an individual level, our families, institutions, and also our communities, right? Isolation and the broken routines and all the uncertainties really have impacted our students, and the impact on those that have already or were already suffering from emotional distress or mental illness, it's been greater, that impact. And so while we're acknowledging that this has been a challenging time for all, and that our students and our families are struggling and that they need support, we also have to flip that coin and also acknowledge that we are resilient, right? Our students are incredibly resilient, and it's up to us. It's our collective responsibility to help foster that resilience in them by providing the tools, the skills, the knowledge, and as much information as we can for them to thrive. We know that for many students, their mental health is at stake, but we also know that there are so many people who are willing to help, right? So many organizations and professionals. And so that's really what we're here to do today, right? To help impart this information so that you are aware of it, so that you can share it with your own children or neighbors, family members, whoever it is that you come across that you see could be struggling. We really need to help them create outlets so that they can thrive during this time. And it is possible. So we have to flip that coin. I know that a lot of times, we focus on the negative, but let's turn the coin, let's turn the page and focus on the positive. We have to communicate that hope, and we have to make the resources available to our youth so that they can create their own toolbox, so that they can reference it when they're feeling overwhelmed or they're feeling like they're losing hope and things are not working out for them. That's why the CDE and our partners at Directing Change and the Teen Line are offering this webinar today so that you can gain the information and the resources to support your own children or family members or those that are around you, right? We want to help you parents, the family members, caregivers, to build your own skills and, gain new information and resources so that you are prepared and feel comfortable in not only recognizing, but also supporting a young person who may be in emotional stress or, even contemplating suicide. Throughout the webinar, I'm going to drop a couple of links in the chat so that you can see the plethora of resources that are available to parents. So there's a couple of ones that I just want to mention, and they are the Help for Students in Crisis webpage, the Teen Mental Health Guide, the Spanish Teen Mental Health Guide, and then a flyer for youth mental health first aid trainings. So I will be dropping those in just a few minutes. And before we get started and before I introduce our guests tonight, I wanted to share this written piece from a student. It does give us a glimpse into what some of our youth may be feeling and the reason why it's really important for us as adults to learn how to recognize when somebody could be suffering. This piece is written by Elizabeth Granillo from Dixon High School. And it says, being in school is hard. Being in online school is harder. Making friends is hard. Making friends during online school is harder. Focusing is hard at school. Focusing on school, at home, and online is harder. Understanding tough concepts in school is hard. Understanding tough concepts online is harder. Finishing assignments in school is hard. Finishing assignments with bad internet at home is harder. Maintaining good mental health during school is hard. Maintaining good mental health at home, alone with no escapes, that's harder. Many people think kids are exaggerating, kids aren't trying hard enough, kids just want to go back to school to see their friends. Now, maybe this is true for some kids, but most kids would just say they're tired. This isn't how it's supposed to be. We aren't supposed to spend the best years of our lives in our rooms. We shouldn't feel like we are under so much pressure that we have no other option than to give up. We are only kids, and many adults want us to grow up because the real world is much harder. But have you ever thought to look back at your elementary, middle, high school, or even college years and imagine how many events, memories, learning opportunities, and friends you would have lost if you were doing this? Kids are tough, kids are strong, kids are resilient, but as kids, we're actually pretty tired of giving school our best effort. We shouldn't have to wake up and see that someone we knew felt so alone that they chose to end their life. We shouldn't be seeing children's lives lost to suicide on the news. This isn't normal. This isn't how it's supposed to be, and this is hard. For what it's worth, take it easier on your kids during this tough time. So that does give us a little glimpse, right? This is why we have to be more vigilant now more than ever so that we can help those that are having a difficult time. Some of you may have heard that written piece on another webinar, but it doesn't hurt to recognize it again and acknowledge these feelings. So with that, I want to introduce our presenters, Stan Collins from Directing Change and Cheryl Eskin from Teen Line. They're going to be providing all of you with essential information on how to check in on your own children or those that you care about. And just a little info on Stan, he has worked in the suicide prevention field for over 20 years. He currently works as a consultant in the field of suicide prevention, focusing on technical assistance in creation and implementation of suicide prevention curricula and strategies. He has a passion for youth-focused suicide prevention and is a co-founder of the Directing Change program and film contest. And Cheryl Eskin is a program director at Teen Line, a teen-to-teen hotline where teenagers can talk to a trained teen listener about any problem, no matter how big or small. She's also the co-chair of the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Network, and she started her mental health career at the age of 14 as a Teen Line listener. That's amazing, Cheryl. She has been a licensed marriage and family therapist since 2002. And with that introduction, I will hand it over to my friend, Stan. Take it away.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You just met, you're gonna meet Cheryl, and me and Cheryl are gonna be kind of tag teaming, swapping off every few slides. So you're gonna hear a lot from both of us. But before we get into the slides and the content tonight, I actually wanted to take the opportunity to share a film from the Directing Change program. So this is a youth-created film. I'm going to give you some more details about the program towards the end tonight. but at least wanted to give you some context to continue that youth message here. So bear with me just 1 second while I share that.
Esta es la historia de mi amigo Tyler. Durante nuestro primer año de la escuela secundaria, comenzó a alejarse de nuestro grupo de amigos. Después de esto, se volvió al alcohol y las drogas. Traté de mostrar mi preocupación, pero no se había dado cuenta de que solo estaba tratando de ayudar.
Bueno, he estado pensando en esto por un tiempo ahora. No puedo seguir así viviendo de esta manera, a menos que algo en mi vida cambie. Así que al fin voy a hacerlo. Voy a buscar ayuda. Así que ha sido 2 meses desde que tenía pensamientos suicidas y estoy muy agradecido por Andrea, que ayudó a salvar mi vida.
All right, hello again. Hopefully the video came through okay and you could hear everything all right. That is just one of literally thousands of films that have been created and submitted to the Directing Change program by youth from around the state. So you're obviously here because you're a parent or you work with youth. So I really encourage you to introduce your kiddos to this program. And we have various categories. And again, I'll give you some more details, but the deadline is coming up on March 1. And I'll also share with you in a moment how to get more resources from Directing Change. But with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the content. You met Cheryl and I just briefly. Again, you're going to get to know us throughout the evening as well. The one thing that wasn't listed in my bio that I think is really important for you to know is that I got involved in this work about the age of 17, 18. I was actually a senior in high school when I started volunteering for the Yellow Ribbon Suicide Prevention Program. And I did that because my freshman year in high school, I lost one of my best friends to suicide. And so I've been on the other end of this issue, dealing with that loss, dealing with the struggles as a youth, and have been honored to spend the last 20 years of my life dedicated to youth suicide prevention. But Directing Change is funded as part of statewide efforts through the California Mental Health Services Authority. It's also part of Each Mind Matters, which is a statewide mental health movement to unify and amplify the voices around the state promoting mental health, reducing stigma, and preventing suicide. As part of Each Mind Matters, there is a branch called the Know the Signs campaign. And through Know the Signs, we have 2 websites, suicideispreventable.org and the Spanish language, elsuicidio.org, or you can go after this presentation to learn more about warning signs, how to have a conversation. And if you work with an organization or a school, we can send you a code to embed that website directly on your organization's website. So you have a full best practice, safe messaging website available to you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my friend and colleague, Cheryl, to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Dan, and thank you everyone for being here today. I think the part that didn't get added on mine is that I'm a parent as well. I have an 11-year-old and a 15-year-old who have both been doing school via Zoom since I think it was March 13th. So I share that to give you an idea that I know what the struggle is like. I'm living it with all of you. And I think that's kind of my first point. Stan and I talked about always setting the intention of this meeting. And I think this time is just so hard overall. There's so much, like Monica alluded to, politically, economically, financially. We're all, struggling in our own way. And so I want to take a moment to just shout out that you're not a bad parent. You're a parent during extraordinary times. We all have moments, where we're not handling things the best we can, or we don't have all the tools. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge that you were here today. You're taking steps to just learn more of how to support your teams, how to support yourselves. And so I want to give everyone props for that and permission that I know a lot, fortunately or unfortunately. I can tell you my kids spend way too much time on YouTube and Among Us and go to bed too late and all those things. My other thing that I wanted to say is that parenting really isn't intended to be 24/7. So if you're kind of, up to here with this situation, you're not alone in that. And I kind of jokingly say school has a bigger purpose than any of us realize. And that poem so brilliantly illustrates for our kids too, not just the social aspect, but the aspect of independent, obviously the academic, but the independent learning skills that are going to help them in their lives. So I want everyone to, take a moment, I think it's now 10 months, to reflect that you've survived the last 10 months. And I'm using the word survived very broadly, whatever that means for you, but you're here tonight. So I'm counting that as something. And of course, we're going to talk about self-care, and we don't really have time to do self-care because Stan and I have so much content for you. But I think we never underestimate the power of deep breathing. So something I like to do is potentially when you have a moment, just even before we start, I say to breathe in for 4 seconds, to hold for 7, and let it out for 8. So if people want to do that on their own or save that as something for a later date to do, I think that's really good to just start off and ground us in being here today. And I think that's going to get us to our next slide. And the best part of our next slide is that I'm going to suggest you screenshot this or take a picture of it to potentially do later, which is so contradictory to everything I am saying, but I just know I want to get as much information as possible. But I think what we're asking you today is to talk about a really tough topic, which hopefully is not something that even comes into your home. But we do know teens are struggling, adults are struggling. We want you to have the tools if someone in your life is struggling, what you can do. But in order to do that, you have to take care of yourself. So we're gonna talk about self-care. There's some brilliant activities. If you have 5 minutes, which I'm the queen of saying I don't have 5 minutes, we all have 5 minutes. So something you can do if you have 5 minutes. If you only have 5, that's great. If you have 15, here's some ideas. If you have 30, there's some ideas as well. So so hopefully take a picture of this, spend some time doing that. That's my homework for all of you coming out of here today. I'm going to turn it over to Stan. And I'm also realizing that Stan and I talk about this stuff a lot. So we talk about it with a certain sense of ease, which doesn't want to undermine how difficult this topic is to even be here and to think about. And, so we appreciate that you're all here today with us.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Cheryl. It takes a lot of courage to be willing to jump in this space, whether you're here tonight because you're worried about one of your kiddos or you want to be prepared in case, or you're worried about one of your child's friends, whatever the circumstances, just want to honor that you're here tonight. So thank you with that. And to move into the conversation about suicide, whatever topic we're talking about, it really needs to start with giving us the right words to use, right? Out of respect for loss survivors and those having dealing with thoughts of suicide. So we wanted to set the table tonight by just giving you some recommended language and terminology on how we address the issue of suicide. So the most common phrase that you will hear when someone has died by suicide is that that person has committed suicide. Now, to play a little word association game, just there at home, fill in the blank with this next statement. What are the other actions that we commit? We commit, and you might think crime, sin, adultery, treason, perjury, a lot of negative things. And so that word committed has a very negative connotation. Now, the reality is that we also commit to our family, our jobs, our friends. But that term committed typically goes to a place of crime or sin. And so there's a lot of shame or bias. And so instead of using the term committed suicide, we ask that people use the term died by suicide, died of suicide, or took their own life. You might also hear people refer to a completed suicide. And that is one that the suicide prevention community is not all on the same page. So really what we're trying to do is avoid the term committed and instead use the term died by. The other one is that you'll hear people refer to successful versus unsuccessful suicide attempts, but really there's no success or lack thereof when it comes to suicide. And these should just simply be referred to as a death by suicide or an attempted suicide. Again, it's very clear what those two statements mean. And it also takes away all the stigma and shame and the bias, not just for loss survivors or attempt survivors, but also for those dealing with thoughts of suicide. Just a little quick picture about suicide. We're not going to get into much data tonight, but coming from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is an anonymous survey we give to youth every couple years, about 17% of youth reported that they had seriously considered suicide in the previous 12 months. So that comes out to almost about 1 in 5 youth. And obviously the numbers, as you see, a little higher with females than males, but in general about 17%. So that's a large chunk of the issue. And really, when we talk about the issue of suicide, of course, every youth death by suicide is a tragedy, but the bigger travesty is that 20% of our youth in a given year are in so much emotional pain that they're considering suicide. And that is really, that's what should embolden us to really take action and continue to talk about mental health and continue to talk about suicide. You see further from that, about 13% said that they went on to make a plan, and that 7% actually made a suicide attempt. And to just kind of explain this a little bit, many people throughout our lives will think about suicide. Most people will have a tough spot, and they'll maybe have some thoughts, and the gears will kick back in. They'll get the help that they need, and they'll get out of that phase. Others, though, will continue down that pathway of pain, and eventually will begin to not just have thoughts of suicide, but actually begin to have thoughts about how to take action towards a suicide. And so that's when creation of a plan in the school setting or in general, this is really what separates someone from being low risk or high risk. Once they start to make plans, take actions, giving away possessions is when we really want to be concerned. So again, just a bigger picture about it's not just deaths by suicide that we need to be concerned about. The good news is that we know what can prevent suicide. Now, suicide can be prevented, but that doesn't mean necessarily that suicide is 100% preventable. What we do know and what you see on the screen is there are certain things that have shown to be effective in preventing suicide. Number one is what you're here tonight to do, which is simply to be aware, to be informed about the warning signs, to know what to look for. This is important for parents, for students, for teachers and educators. But then also, once you recognize those warning signs, being comfortable and being courageous enough to have a conversation and asking directly about suicide. Once we know that someone is having thoughts of suicide, we need to help keep them safe. We're going to talk about something called a safety plan tonight, removing lethal means or access to ways that they could harm themselves from their environment. We need to make sure that they're getting connected to a mental health professional, not just any mental health professional. If you broke your foot, you wouldn't just look for an orthopedic, you would look for a podiatrist, right? You would look for somebody that specializes in that part of that skill set. And same with suicide. When you're connecting your child to a mental health professional, make sure that you're interviewing the counselor and the mental health professional and saying, what type of training have you had about ongoing care for suicide? Because unfortunately, one of the realities is that many mental health professionals will tell you that they don't have adequate training in dealing with suicide. The good news is that there are many amazing mental health professionals out there who are willing and capable to take on a patient who's having those thoughts, though. And then in general, what we also need to do is respond to suicide risk in the least restrictive way. And we're going to talk about some of those options, but unfortunately, the common response to suicide has been law enforcement or an ambulance to a hospital. And while that may be needed in some circumstances when the person absolutely can't keep themselves safe or that people around them can't, in most circumstances, a less restrictive, more de-escalation focused type response that's less traumatizing the youth is what's called for. Now, one of the questions I always get is what causes suicide? For a long time, we talked about how bullying causes suicide, or people will say that breakups cause suicide, or even a pandemic causes suicide. And the reality is that never one thing causes suicide. And I'll use the analogy of the board game Jenga that you see on the screen. So with the board game Jenga, you have the blocks, and the blocks are stacked up, and as you play, people are pulling the blocks away from the structure. Eventually, somebody will pull out a block that will cause the whole tower to fall. And so that person loses, right? Because we say that person, that one block caused the tower to fall. Now, in reality, we know it wasn't just that one block. It was all those other pieces that had been pulled out. That last block was simply the straw that broke the camel's back. And if we use this as a metaphor for suicide, we often point to that last block as what causes suicide. but it's really all those other pieces that have been pulled out. And more importantly than that, it's not that those pieces have been pulled out, it's that that structure got so weakened to a point where one block or one risk factor or one life circumstance caused the whole thing to fall apart. Now, we wish we could protect youth and stop bad things from happening to them, but we know that we can't. What we can do though, and we're going to talk, Cheryl's going to talk about this in just a second, is we can help to make youth more resilient. We can help them to sturdy their foundations and also know and be more empowered to ask for help when they feel that they need it. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cheryl to talk about some of the things we can do to make youth more resilient.
Yeah. And even before the pandemic, resilience was a word we heard a lot. And I think with this pandemic, it's tested all of us. We've all had a lot of losses, you know, of things we used to love, or activities, things of that sort. If you remember, developmentally, teens particularly are expected to, this is a time where they're supposed to be pulling away from their parents, where they're becoming more independent, where their peer group are their biggest influences. And that's about as painful as it is when our teens pull away from us. It's developmentally normal. And so a lot of the challenges right now is they're, you know, not where they're supposed to be developmentally. And that can be very challenging for a lot of reasons. Teens don't also have the life experience we have. So it's easy to think this is, I mean, for a lot of us as adults, I think this feels like it's been forever. But we have the perspective to know there have been other things in life before that we've gotten through and moved on. Our teens don't always have that perspective. So that's something to remember when you're, you know, working with your teen. And I think in general, there's certain things we can do to help build our kids' resilience, to help build their coping skills, whether or not we're concerned about suicide or whether or not we're concerned about their mental health. And I think one of them, this is obviously at your comfort level, but continuing to encourage them to have connections with their peer group or with their friends. If they're isolated, find ways to get them involved in something or with someone. Obviously at your comfort level, some people are comfortable with outside play dates. My kids would hate that I just used that word. Outdoor time with friends, masked and distance, playing some sports activities. Some aren't comfortable with that. There's a lot of games. There's a lot of activities that teens have cultivated online so that they do have some sort of connection. And I honestly do think, I mean, we're not getting into video games or any of that, but I do think video games do have some merit for helping teens be connected right now during this tough time. Among Us has been a really popular activity for my kids as well, that they might play with peers or they play other things with peers. So it's not the same as just normal screen time if you think about it. It seems to be more interactive. So encouraging that. If there's family members that they can keep connected with or call, my son figured out pretty early on that, you know, if he FaceTimed with grandma, then he would get more screen time. That counted in there. And so he's, you know, really built on this relationship with grandma and other family members. I think another thing that's important for parents is to promote and show healthy emotional skills. They look to us, even when they're 16, 17, and don't, you know, pretend like they don't look to us. They look at how we handle things and we role model. So if we can model some of these things we're doing for self-care, what we're doing to take care of ourselves, even using some of those words, you know, I feel really frustrated today, or I'm having a tough day, I'm mad, this is what I do. That goes a long way with encouraging them to practice some of these skills. There's things, there's a lot of like family yoga, family mindfulness, different things you can do to build upon this. And I also think exercise, that means very different things to different people, but research has really shown that exercise is one of those just like kind of natural highs that does help reduce stress and depression. Particularly we say with teens, too, sometimes eye contact and sitting and talking is just too much for them. And that's like car rides in previous life used to be really good sometimes for having this communication with your teens. Walks can kind of do that as well, because you're not necessarily having eye contact. You kind of sometimes split things in where it's different than when you're sitting across from them. So these are some important things to think about, by no means comprehensive list. So Dan, you can go on. Yeah, and we talked about this as well. I mean, for better or worse, your home is their safe space right now. So ways we can make it more of the safe space is being, emotionally present is a word we use a lot, that a lot of us feel like we're around our kids 24/7 and I'm always here. But how often, and my kids call me on this too, how often are we actually present? Maybe we're sitting next to them, but we're on our phone, we're on our devices, we're, watching TV, we're doing this, and we're not really there for them in an emotional way. So remembering that to, perhaps if they come to you with something that's important they want to talk about, that's the time to put down the phone. That's the time to devote some one-on-one attention to them, which doesn't mean they have to rule your lives. And the second they come to talk to you, put down the phone, but at least an awareness of, hey, I need 5 more minutes and then I'd love to talk to you. We're also going to talk today about resources, that if you're struggling, if your teen is struggling, know where you can go, because there are a lot of places out there, some free, low cost as well. A lot of places doing telehealth, so you don't even have to leave your house. And we talked about this earlier, but finding your support. That if you're struggling, the most important thing you can do for your teen's mental health is to take care of your own mental health. So that's an important thing. Find your supports, find the things that are working for you. And if things aren't working for you right now, then now's a good time to seek out some support in your life. And then a quick little thing we wanted to say, there's so much stigma around mental health, particularly if you're a parent and your teen, might have to, I'm using the word loosely, your teen needs help or support or struggling. There's so much stigma on that. And there's so much that we feel, what did I do wrong? This is, something I messed up. That's not the case. And please don't let that interfere with you getting help for your teen. That's an important thing to remember, that the best parents can have teens who struggle, but that healing does take time, that it's not, Stan uses a lot of great analogy, but things don't necessarily go away overnight. It's not you go to one therapy session and life is better. So it may take time, it may take a commitment, but we also do know there are very many adults who struggle as teens who grow up to be happy, productive, successful young adults. So you have a 15-year-old who's struggling, that doesn't mean that their life is not going to be great and it's not going to be great and wonderful. So recognizing that and giving them that permission too, that maybe this is the time we lower our expectations of what they can handle until they can work up back to their level that they used to be. And so now we're kind of getting to the meat of this. And pre-COVID life, this was a lot easier, because we could know when to worry. We could know when things are out of whack, per se. A lot of the stuff that we say right now is signs to worry about your teens being moody. Our teens are moody right now because they're tired of this. So that's the caveat I will put in there. And teens are by nature dealing with hormones, dealing with emotions, dealing with a lot. So mood changes can be normal, but there are times where it's more than, normal. And I would say one of the biggest things is to trust your gut. Like that time, I don't know, I had this time where, you took your toddler to the pediatrician and they said, no, they're fine. I don't, everything's okay. And then later that night, they woke up with like 103 fever and ear infections. Your kid, when something's off. And so that's we're going to give you a few tips on that, but paying attention to what you know about your kid and just trusting your gut. If your intuition says something's off, probably something is. Yeah. And these are some of the questions. And like I say, some of this is comical. Has your child lost interest in things? Most of us have lost interest in a lot of things. Dramatic mood changes, changes in behavior, more angry, aggressive, irritable. A lot of these things are COVID specific and we see them a lot, but sometimes it's more than that. And usually what we look for as a hallmark of when to worry is a big change from baseline. So if you had a teen who was always pretty quiet and didn't engage much with the family or activities, and they're still like that, that's not as worrisome as the teen who was, always with their friends, always involved with activities, and now is hiding in their room every day, doesn't want to talk to anyone, doesn't want to do school. We also look at things like hygiene, sleep, eating, how they care about grades in school, lack of motivation. Again, like I said, change in baseline of what they were like before is a time that we can, be concerned. And some of this isn't one day. This is generally a pattern over time. So it's maybe not that one day that they sleep all day, but you're noticing they're sleeping more often than not, or they're not showing up for their classes, or they're not doing their homework. They're not engaging with the family. Another important thing to realize is they're engaging in risky behavior. And part of that is being a teen, is testing the envelope, is seeing how far they can get away with things. And that, there's part of that, we all did that as teens as well. It's also hard because their desire to be social is so high. So they may be doing things that, are against your family values, maybe going out without a mask or going, socializing people they don't want to be at. But we're also talking about risky behavior like driving without a license, increased use of alcohol or drugs, promiscuity, things that just worry you. Giving away belongings is a big one as well. Teens don't necessarily make wills like older people might, but teens are attached often to their things. So if you see your teen or your teen tells you that their friend gave you their iPhone, something like that, that to me is a big warning sign something's amiss, because what teen is giving away their iPhone? I will also say, just going back a little to the angry, agitated, irritable, I hate to gender type, and both of my kids are probably yelling at me if they could hear me for doing this, but stereotypically, girls tend to be more emotional and dramatic, more crying. Boys tend to be more angry, agitated, irritable, maybe like breaking things, tantrums, things of that sort. So that may be a gender differentiation, but again, not absolute. This will send this out after. This is a really good list of asking yourself some of these questions. And if more of the answers are yes than no, then that's the time to, be concerned.
Great. Thanks so much, Cheryl. And so, really when it comes down to it, the only way to know whether or not an individual or a child is thinking about suicide is to have a conversation about that. But we're going to spend just a few moments here talking about, so we've talked about some worrisome behavior, but now we're getting into behaviors that are specific to typically to suicide behavior. So on the screen, you see the three kind of critical top warning signs. Of course, if a youth is talking about death, if they're speaking about suicide. Now, part of that, again, it's normal for anyone, especially a youth, to consider, life and death and to ponder that. But when it becomes a regular issue, also when youth begin to look for ways to harm themselves, maybe they're searching online for ways to make a suicide attempt, or start to acquire mechanisms or means to make a suicide attempt. That's obviously very concerning. And at the bottom, this is really at the heart of the issue of suicide. When I simplify suicide down to its two most basic factors, it comes down to pain and hope. And suicides, in my opinion, happen when pain outweighs hope. And so what we're also looking for is simply hopelessness, because we as individuals, we have an amazing ability to persevere. As Monica spoke to, we are resilient. But when today was worse than the day before, and tomorrow is worse than, as things continue to get worse, we start to lose that hope. That's when suicide really starts to come into the picture and become an issue. I showed a brief picture earlier of the Know the Signs website. I wanted to just share with you a quick screenshot. As you see, you can choose specifically teen warning signs. And when you're on the website, as you scroll over any of these, I will give you a little bit more detail. What does that look like? Also on the website, you can find what do these statements sound like, and what are some of the things that you can say. But other warning signs, Cheryl covered a lot of them, but especially that giving away of possessions or people who start to make plans to not be here anymore. That's when we want to be especially concerned. But what you can do is that if you feel, if any part of you, and again, the warning sign does not have to be on the list. As Cheryl said, your kid's been in anyone. If something doesn't feel right, it's probably not right. And the only way you're going to know is to talk directly about suicide. So you need to find the words to have that conversation. And we're going to go through that here in just a second. Express your concern. Let them know what you've noticed. Let them know that you're worried about them. Let them know that you love them unconditionally. and you just want to make sure that they're doing okay. But then it comes down to this, kind of the moment of truth, which is simply asking the question, are you thinking about suicide? Have you ever thought of ending your life? Have you ever thought about not being here tomorrow? Whatever format you come up with it, the one question you do not want to ask is, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Because that doesn't speak to the issue of suicide. Because if someone who's having thoughts of suicide is in overwhelming pain, they might accidentally or incorrectly perceive suicide as a way to end their pain. So you want to be direct. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about ending your life? And it's a very tough question. And to be honest with you, I've asked this question tens of thousands of times, oftentimes to complete strangers. And the few times in my life that I've had to ask it of a niece or a nephew, a family member, a friend, or someone that I love, it has been one of the most difficult moments in my life. But what I also find is that the moment you ask someone, are you thinking about suicide? And if they are having thoughts of suicide, it's almost like they immediately decompress, like they are immediately a little bit less at risk for suicide, because now suicide's not this big bad wolf in their head. Suicide is something that's on the table. And you've let them know that you're not scared to say the S word, to talk about suicide. Even if you're frightened inside, you've let them know that we're going to get through this together. A lot of people also fear about talking about suicide because they think that talking about it will cause it to happen. There's been numerous research studies that have shown that talking about suicide does not cause it to happen. And in fact, every suicide prevention program around will tell you that the first step in preventing suicide is talking openly and directly about it. So a few tips for effective communication in that moment. Cheryl talked about the importance of, you need to make sure you're in the right place so that you can help others earlier, and the power of breathing. Before you're about to have this conversation, first just center yourself, focus yourself. Also create a safe environment, not just physically safe, but maybe, kind of the environment as she talked about. Maybe it's not sitting across from your couch from the kiddo and looking them in the eye. Maybe it's going for a walk or a hike or doing a project. I remember growing up, me and my dad always had our deepest conversations when we were doing some sort of yard work or handyman project. So that might be a way to make it a little better. I also don't rush this. Prior to school or prior to you getting ready for work is maybe not the best time to have that conversation. Make sure it's a good time for you and also for your kid to be able to jump into this. You want to make sure you have your resources gathered ahead of time so you're not scrambling in the moment if they do say yes or thinking about suicide. And so many people ask me, well, what do I say? What do I say if they say yes? And the most important thing you can do is to listen, to really listen. There's a saying that says we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. And a lot of times it's not about saying the right thing or really saying anything. It's just simply about being there to listen. And also knowing that you don't have to have all or any of the answers. And in responding to your kid saying, I don't know, but we're going to figure this out together, is a perfectly acceptable response. And finally, people will often ask me, well, when's the best time to talk to my kid about suicide? And I always tell them the best time to talk to your child about suicide prevention and mental health is when you're not at all concerned about them. And so that you can kind of create that space and set the table. Now, obviously, if you're having concerns, then that means now is the time. But otherwise, the more we can try to build these conversations and as part of our normal interactions with our kids, the healthier those conversations will be and the less big of a deal it will be to talk about these topics. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl, and she's going to kind of bring us down the 2 flowchart paths, right? What if they say no, and what if they say yes? So Cheryl, it's all yours.
Yeah. And before we get into that, just quickly, a perfect segue is even letting your kids know you went to this presentation tonight, and this is what they this is what you learned, depending on what's comfortable for you. It's even asking, is this something that's come up with their friends? Is this something, how much do they know about it? Just kind of creating that open dialogue is just a great avenue, and expressing to them, maybe some of you are here because you're concerned, or you're here just to learn more, but expressing, you want to be a resource, you want to know as much as, you want to know as much as possible, and that they can come to you. So here's the question. So obviously, as Stan said, asking your child or anyone in your life if they're suicidal, terrifying. And you're secretly, I imagine, hoping, praying, whatever you do, that they say, they say no. And that's the case a lot of the time. Sometimes they may not, and we'll get into that. What if they say no? Um, Obviously, you asked for a reason. I don't think we just walked up to our kid out of the blue sky and say, hey, Stan, are you thinking about, have you ever thought about suicide? So you asked because you were concerned about something. So I think continue to talk about it. Let them know what you've observed. Let them know what you've been hearing. Let them know about the importance of, keeping good mental health in this pandemic. Encourage them to reach out to other resources. Maybe great, I'm so thrilled you're not suicidal, but it seems like maybe you're having a hard time with your anger. Is there somewhere you could talk to about that? Teen Line, which I'll get into more as a peer-based resource, which is really helpful sometimes to talk to another teen about what's going on rather than the adult that's in their lives. And I think on that note, knowing it's really important that our kids have a trusted adult to talk to. In an ideal world, it would be us. And there's nothing more hurtful than our kid not wanting to talk to us. But I think this is the time we kind of get rid of our ego, whatever word you want to use, and just be happy they're talking to someone. So if they don't feel comfortable talking to you, but they'll talk to Aunt Sandra, that's fabulous. Or if there's a coach, if there's someone in their life they will talk to. But I think it's important to remind them you are there. You are a resource for them. I don't think we always have to like our kids every moment, but I do think we have to love them unconditionally. And I think that's an important thing to let them know. Even when you're upset, you're frustrated, I love you no matter what. I'm here for you. I think as Stan talked about, the importance of listening. I mean, so many of us think of maybe your parents or why you didn't come to people in your life. A lot of times we lecture and we judge, which are things that do not make people really want to talk to us. So it's our time to hold our tongue sometimes and really just listen to what they have, what they have to say, what their frustrations. A lot of times they don't want us to fix it either. They just want us to listen. And we put in our, mommy fix it hat, and that's not necessarily what they need. I also think we'll put in there to stay vigilant. If you're noticing behaviors, continue to check in with them on a regular basis about that. And again, like we talked about, there's no shame in seeking out more support for your teen or for your family. A lot of schools are still most schools are still providing resources, or individual group support, even though we're not meeting in person. So now we're going to go on to what if they say yes. And I realize there's a lot of information in a really short period of time. So this will be available after the fact, and we'll stay on for questions as well. So if they say yes and say they've been having thoughts of suicide, I think the most important thing is to stay calm. Obviously, inside you're terrified. I'm a licensed mental health professional. I've asked people this a lot, but I could tell you if it was my own kid, how hard that would be. But if we can manage to remain calm, we can help them through it. Because when we get up here, they kind of get the message, this is too much for us. My mom can't handle it. She's going to fall apart. I need to take care of her. And that may have been the reason they didn't tell you in the first place. They also may feel like they're too much of a bother because it's just creating all this drama. So as much as we stay calm, we can set the tone for setting things in motion. I also think it's important to take it seriously. Unfortunately, kids are dying by suicide or attempting suicide at younger ages. So I think it's really important to take it seriously and not minimize and not say, no, you're not. You're just having a bad day. It's important to, well, what's going on that you're saying these kinds of things? These kinds of things are serious. I think it's important to thank them for telling you as well and find out, again, what are the reasons they feel this way? What's been going on in their life that they're at this point? And again, we talked about listening. Stan's going to get into what else you can do, because obviously this is a lot to be, you have a kid who's thinking about suicide. We want to make sure there's a plan in place to keep them safe. But these are at least the first steps. So take it seriously, remain calm, and then we'll get into the next slide. And I think is this you, Stan, or is this me? Doesn't matter. I guess I can continue. But I was going to say,
either way.
Yeah, me. Okay. I was going to say a teen who's thinking, or even a youth who's thinking about suicide, particularly if they have a plan. And we talk about, Stan talked about people thinking about it and then maybe making a plan and then maybe attempting for like 3 different levels. So if your teen has a plan That's a little more immediate than a teen who's just thinking about it vaguely but doesn't have a concrete plan. So, but any teen who's thinking about suicide does need to be evaluated, does need to be put in contact with someone who can, put them in touch with the right resources, assess how serious it is, what needs to be done in the moment. So National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 24/7, 365. They're Spanish speaking. There's a lot of other languages as well. So that's a great resource where they can talk to a trained professional who can assess what's going on. School, like I mentioned, a lot of support based there, pediatricians, family doctors. If it's really immediate where you feel like you can't keep your child safe, it's important to either call 911 or transport them to a hospital, because again, stigma or not, most important thing is to keep your child safe, and to remember that again, take it seriously, even if you don't think it's serious. This is their way they're communicating with you that they're in pain, and we want to listen to that pain and help them with it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cheryl. One of the things you can do in the immediate as well. So as Cheryl talked about, once that conversation, if the answer is yes, you definitely need to get them assessed by somebody who knows what they're doing. But in the short term, one of the things you can do to help just keep you and your family safe is to sit down with them and create a safety plan. So a safety plan is something that typically a mental health professional will do. If your child goes to see a mental health professional, you're going to want to make sure that they also do one, or they update the one you have. But you see that My3 app is something available on iPhone and Android for free, both in English and Spanish. And basically, the way that I describe it, it's teaching somebody to swim against the rip current rather than hoping that there's going to be a lifeguard there. And so what it does is it asks an individual to, what are my own stressors? What are my own reactions to stress? What are some of my coping strategies that are easy for me that can calm me down? Who are some of the people, or what are some of the places I can go to help distract me from these thoughts? And then finally, it comes down to what do I do when I'm in crisis? And so this can all be contained in the app on the phone. Again, it's free. You see a screenshot of what that looks like, but please look into creating a safety plan for you or your family members. And not even necessarily just for suicide, just anyone who's showing distress or who's just been kind of off lately. It's always good for us to know what to do when we're in crisis. Now, Cheryl mentioned the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And one of the things I want to emphasize with them is that it's not just for people in crisis. The National Lifeline, the crisis text line, teen line even, there is not a threshold of crisis that you need to surpass before you can reach out to them. If you're having a bad day, if after this webinar you have some emotions rise to the surface and you need to talk to somebody, if you have someone in your life who recently passed away from suicide and you need just a listening ear, or if you're preparing to talk to your child, or you just did talk to your child and suicide was part of that conversation, of course you can contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So I want you to get your phones out again, and please take a screenshot of these images right here. One is for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline on the left, and the crisis text line is on the right. They're two separate organizations, but they offer kind of the similar service. So the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is obviously a phone number, 1-800-273-8255. You can also go to suicidepreventionlifeline.org and do an online chat with the crisis counselor, whereas the crisis text line, as you would imagine, is support over text. So you would text hello to 741-741. Both teams, both organizations have amazingly trained people. Obviously, the crisis text line is often more appealing to youth. But Cheryl's going to talk for just a second. Teen Line, the organization that she represents, is one of the best kept secrets in the crisis response. We were just talking about this. It's absolutely amazing. So in addition to the crisis text line, the National Lifeline, teens can call Teen Line to talk to another teen who's been trained. So Cheryl, I'll let you explain a little more about that.
Yeah, I know we're running low on time, but very quickly, Teen Line is what we sound like. We train about 60 to 80 teens in the LA area to be listeners for their peers, and we train them at every topic imaginable. And so when they, if a teen reaches out to Teen Line, they're going to get another teen like them. And again, talking to the power of peer support, teens are much more likely to talk to a peer about what's going on than the adults in their lives. And a lot of times our teens are definitely not anti-adults or anti-support. So a lot of times they will be the ones who suggest, hey, I think it might be a good idea to talk to your mom or dad about this. And sometimes hearing that from a teen is more powerful than us saying it to them. So we do have a hotline, we do have text, we have an app we're affiliated with called Teen Talk. We also have an online message board. We're open every night, 6 to 10 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After 24 hours, if you call us, you're going to get someone. We roll over to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline after hours, but between 6 and 10, you'll actually get a teen. In terms of age, we usually go up to about 19, 20 because we're staffed by high school students. I would say youngest we've heard probably 10. If they can talk intelligently about an issue and want someone to reach out to, then it's an appropriate resource. I guess the only criteria would be that they have something to talk about. It's not just like, hey, I'm bored. This is, it doesn't need to be, I'm suicidal. The majority of our calls are about relationships, but just, if they have something they want to talk to someone about. And Stan, I think, is going to show. And our website also has a lot of good information for parents and just in general. But this may be a good thing to screenshot and show to your kids that we are here.
I'm just giving folks another second to
Yes.
get a picture of this. I'm sorry, I meant to advance the slide a little bit sooner.
No, that's okay.
And I see that we're getting a lot of great questions, a lot of great engagement on Facebook. For those of you who are actually signed into the webinar, know that we're going to stay on for a while and answer all the questions, so we're not going anywhere. But I see a lot of great questions, so know they're going to come out. And Wendell, also, thanks for the kind words and the shout out there. I appreciate that. One other resource we want to share with you is something called the Trevor Lifeline from the Trevor Project. And this is a 24/7 crisis hotline specifically for LGBTQ youth and young adults. Again, an amazing program. They also have Trevor Space, Trevor Chat, so remarkable resources, both text and phone, folks who are specifically trained, and most of which the staff that I've met identify as part of the LGBTQ community. So I want to let you know about that one as well. And then this brings us back to the program that we started the night with, which is the Directing Change Program and Film Contest. So the website is directingchangeca.org. We have film submissions in 30 and 60-second categories. There's our website down at the bottom. We also offer a number of educational resources, both for schools, for parents, for youth as well. And so basically how the program works is that all the things we want youth to know about mental health and suicide prevention, what to look out for, how to reach out for help, what are the resources. It all happens, but it happens organically through the creation of film. And we also know that we learn the most when we create. And so it's not just about a 30-minute presentation. It's about giving kids all that information or connecting them with those presentations, but then really using their hands, their mind, their hearts, their souls to create these films is really where it starts to resonate and stays with them for years after their participation. So again, please encourage the kids that the kids in your lives to submit a film. We also have a category called Through the Lens of Culture, where they can submit films about the topics of mental health and suicide, but exploring them through culture, whether that's nerd culture, jock culture, Latino culture, LGBTQ culture, whatever that may be. And again, we shared these earlier, but just wanted to give you another chance to take a picture of the two suicide prevention websites out there. Suicidespreventable.org and El Suicidio es Prevenible. And for more information, you can contact myself or Cheryl. Here again are the websites, both for Teen Line as well as for the Directing Change program. And with that, we're going to turn it over to some questions. Monica, if you don't mind, do you want to guide us through some questions, or there's some questions I definitely wanted to make sure that we cover? Few questions.
Absolutely. Sorry about that, Stan.
No, it's okay.
I'm
No, you're
kind of
answering on Facebook too. Yeah,
I'm toggling between and trying to answer the Facebook questions and the concerns. But so yeah.
So I have some questions here that I picked out that I'd like to
sure, go for it.
Real quick. And then how much longer are we going to stay live on Facebook? Are we going to stay for a while?
We're on until 7.
Okay, so we still have plenty of time for both.
Yes.
Okay, great. One question, this one's just kind of fun. Stan, are you an MFT? Actually, this may surprise you, but I'm not a mental health professional. I have a bachelor's degree in social science, and I share that with you because you don't have to be a mental health professional to dig into or dive into suicide prevention or to be good at preventing suicide. And actually, I'm going to pause for just 1 second because there's construction in the background. So Monica, I'm going to let you take the lead for 1 second while I shut a door.
Yes, and here's an important, it's a message more than a question, but somebody is sharing that their 16-year-old son took his life this past May, and he kept it from every adult in his life, including his psychiatrist and psychologist and every other adult. Nobody had a clue that he was having these thoughts. However, he was telling peers for about a month about his dark thoughts. None of them made a move. And so this parent is just saying, you know, they recommend to go through your child's cell phone and check all the apps and scroll up and up and up and read it all for clues. They feel that if they had done some of this, that they would have realized what was going on because it was buried in all of their stuff. So this person wanted to make sure that we shared this because this is not a unique experience to them.
Yeah, I would just add to that too. I think that further emphasizes the need. A lot of people think, or used to think, maybe not so much anymore, that we shouldn't be talking to kids about suicide. But based on the numbers we shared with you earlier, one of the questions was that national data or California data. The data we shared earlier was California, but to be honest with you, it's pretty consistent across the country. About 1 in 5 youth think about 1 in 10 will make an attempt. But I think that, again, emphasizes the need, and that's something we do in the Directing Change program, is emphasizing the need to tell a trusted adult if one of your friends, and that's for any youth suicide prevention program, we tell them not to keep a secret, that I'd rather lose the friendship than lose the friend. But as adults, there's only ever so much that we will know about what's going on in our youth lives, even if we think we have the finger on the pulse. But it's so important for us to educate the other kids and the other youth to be vigilant and talk.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. And if I can add to that really quickly, sorry, Cheryl, is that, you know, a lot of folks think that if you start talking about suicide with their children, right? There was a comment that said, why would I ever talk to my child about suicide? Well, because it's important. And like you said earlier, Stan, it's important to start these conversations before you're concerned. You should be having dinner time discussions about mental health and mental wellness. Why is it important? Why should I talk to my children? Because at some point they might be considering it. So I don't know if either one of you can sort of just elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think what I was going to say to the person who posted, first of all, how sorry I am for your loss. And to take some of the, I mean, I know it's impossible, some of the guilt from you, that teens are sneaky sometimes too. As much as you can go through their phones and look through every app, what they don't want you to see, you don't always see. So I'm not saying it's not important to you, but I'm saying that, you know, even if you were to look through their phone, there might be things. And that goes to what, you know, what we're talking about, having these conversations. Part of our message of Directing Change in Teen Line, empowering teens to be ambassadors, to tell a trusted adult. There is this teen culture where they think they can handle it on their own, or they think they have it and they don't need us as adults. And so we're really trying to break that and really trying to go into schools and spread that message. And if you're concerned about a friend, tell someone. A lot of the social media sites have flags these days. They've gotten a lot better, where you can flag a friend that you're concerned about and resources will be sent their way, or they flag them on their own these days as well. So that's something, you know, that's something to know about. So no consolation for your horrible pain, and so glad that you're here and, you know, sharing your experience.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Cheryl. So whoever that was, again, our thoughts and prayers are with you, and really appreciate you continuing to speak up. So thank you for that. Another couple questions I just wanted to get to really quickly before we get into some of the heavier ones. In the survey, what was the age group for youth? So the Youth Risk Behavior Survey and the California Healthy Kids Survey, they survey youth in 7th, 9th, and 11th grade. So those were averages over those 3 age groups. When we're talking about youth tonight, we're really kind of talking about like 10 to 18-year-olds, which may sound strange, but we're seeing more and more suicide risk assessments and suicide risk popping up, even at the elementary age. So there was also a comment about what about the younger kiddos? So a lot of our prevention efforts, for the past 20 years have focused on the high school level. Over the past 5 years or so, I think we've started to add the middle school into that. And over the last couple of years, there was a recent mandate that expanded, requiring all schools that serve pupils in grades pre-K through 12 have policies around suicide prevention. So really what we're looking at is that it really needs to be a life skill. Every educator needs to be trained in suicide prevention, every adult who is around youth. Now, obviously, you're not going to walk into a first grade classroom and talk about suicide as you would in a 7th grade or a 9th grade classroom. But there are programs out there, big emphasis on social and emotional learning, getting them to understand the concepts of mental health and mental wellness. One question I do want to address too is how do we work around insurance constraints with options for service providers, which can be really difficult, especially if you're looking for somebody with a specialty in suicide risk and management. One place I would say to start is working with your school. Many schools have a partnership with an organization called Care Solace that helps to work through any insurance or payment issues while also identifying the right match for you in the mental health. But your schools would be a great place to start. Also contacting your local crisis line. They can oftentimes match you appropriately with the right person. One other asterisk to that whole conversation, unfortunately, though, is that some of the best mental health professionals do not accept insurance, and you do have to pay out of pocket for it. So that is can be very frustrating for some, but there's still a lot of good people who take insurance, a lot of ways around it. So don't hesitate to reach out to your school. I don't know if Cheryl or Monica, you have anything to add to that.
No. I would say there's also a lot of good support groups out there. Dee Dee Hirsch, who operates our local suicide prevention line, does offer support groups for survivors of suicide loss and also for people who are struggling with suicidal feelings themselves. So that's a great resource. And a lot of those are free. A lot of those are free or low cost.
Yeah, great point. Another question asks, is the school district psychologist doing any Zooms for the students? Has a phone number been given to the students at the beginning of class as a resource to kids that are depressed or contemplating suicide? Actually, it varies by district. It may not always be the school psychologist. It may be a school counselor or a school mental health professional who is doing the assessment or checking in with the kiddo. Again, we also want the average educator to be able to have an initial check-in with kids. But every kid in grades 7 through 12 in California, when they were issued their school ID starting last year, their number for the National Suicide Prevention Crisis Line, the crisis text line, are all included on the back of their ID cards. But it's still good to let kids know that these are resources. And also, as a parent, a great strategy for you. Oftentimes, kids are scared to reach out to one of these resources because they're worried that their parents will see it on the phone bill. So talking to your kids and saying, hey, if you ever need to reach out to one of these resources, please don't hesitate. I'm not going to say, oh, I caught you. What are you doing? I would hope that you trust me enough to also come talk to me. But again, just because your kid contacts Teen Line or the crisis text line does not mean necessarily that they're having thoughts of suicide. They just needed somebody to talk to. So I hope that answers part of that question, but a lot of different ways that schools are going about checking in with kids.
There's another question, Stan and Cheryl. What if you have a teen who does not vocalize their feelings due to a disability? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll let Cheryl take that unless you'd like me to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, and I don't know the disability if it limits communication or physical or anything of that sort. But we do know, I mean, that people in general, or specifically teens who may be different, for lack of a better word, can sometimes struggle. Because as a teen, you just really want to fit in. And if you're not in the same place as your peers, that can really be hard. there are finding ways to communicate. I will say, I don't know if we're talking autism spectrum at all, but there's been a lot of training at Suicide Prevention Lifeline for working with autistic callers and recognizing that they might communicate in different ways than a neurotypical teen might. Probably some of the communication may be the ways you've found to do anyways. Maybe it's play, maybe it's art, maybe it's drawing, maybe it's like Stan said, an outdoor activity, like you did handy stuff with your dad. So finding ways to kind of meet them where they are. And if there are professionals in their life, maybe getting their feedback on the best ways to, approach some of these topics as well.
Yeah, and I would just add to that also, not just, whatever the disability may be, not just looking for someone who specializes in that disability, but if you're starting to notice mental health issues or suicide come in, find somebody with both those skill sets can be really, really a key part of that. So it's all about asking the questions and making sure and not settling for anything less than the right person to care for your child. The first person you're matched up with does not have to be the person you are connected to. Maybe they have a role with the care for your child, but somebody else needs to be brought in. And now with so many things being virtual, I guess the one bright side would be that there is so much greater access to people, not just locally, but across the country who may specialize with a certain disability or certain issue. All right, Monica, did you have another one or would you like me to pick one?
I do have another one. How about kids who are diagnosed with PTSD? They tend to hide their true emotions. What are the indicators? How do you engage kids who already have a hard time expressing themselves?
It's a great question. And I think for me, I would focus on, I'm about to turn 40 this year and I'm still figuring out how to express my emotions properly. So that's a life skill. So I would say really doing the work and spending the time and having also a lot of patience about that, about expression of those feelings. And also, as Cheryl said, you kind of get used to what is normal, what is abnormal for your child, not to your child versus the rest of humanity, but for your child. And so figuring out what are those lanes. And again, by having repeated conversations and having mental health be just a part of what you do with your child or with the people in your lives, it makes it less big of a deal to have the bigger conversations. But Cheryl, I'm sure you have something to add on to that as well.
Yeah, no, I was agreeing with you. I actually saw a comment to the earlier question that I thought was good. If people didn't say that children with I think maybe LD or delayed development can express frustration in a variety of ways, find outlets for them to express it that are in their skill set. So recognizing that as well.
Yeah, we're also learning more and more over the last few years about adverse childhood experiences and the impact of that on PTSD and trauma with youth. So more and more in the education system, people are becoming so much more adept at working with youth who have struggled with trauma in the past as well.
And what we know, to Stan's point, is that a coping skill that might work for you may be very different than what works with your child. So trying out different things until you find something that may work or may resonate with them. So it's not one size fits all.
Yeah, that makes me think in 2001, when I was in college, I actually testified before the United States Senate back in Washington, D.C. on youth suicide. And I was a youth at the time. And I remember this was at a time when they were blaming music for suicide. So it was Nirvana and Marilyn Manson. And one of the senators said that, we need to abolish all that type of music. And what I responded to them with is that, yeah, for some people, they might go to that music and it might bring them down darker. But for myself and many others, it made us not feel alone. As dark as some of that music is, it's like, oh, wait, someone else feels this way. So, it's all about finding what it is for you. And I'm not encouraging kids listen to dark music when they're in a dark place, but maybe for a time, maybe that just helps them feel connected, and then we can transition to something else. So again, everybody is unique. And one of the most important questions that I don't think we ask kids who are struggling enough is, what do you need? What do you think will keep you safe? What do you think will help you get better? And simply asking the question, what can I do? So just, making it very personalized is really important.
Right. There's a couple of questions, Stan and Cheryl. regarding suggestions or how to address this topic for younger students. So they say, you know, there's a lot of focus for teens, and how can we address this with those that are younger than 11?
Yeah, I think I mean, obviously it depends on the developmental stage of your child. There's some very mature 10-year-olds and some who, you know, are not ready to have these big conversations, and all of that is in the realm of normal. But I think it's age appropriate language. I mean, my kids, for better or worse, have been having these conversations probably younger than I might advise. But I think in the younger years, and part of the reality is if they're online, they know so much more than we think they know anyways. So sometimes it's correcting misperceptions. That they may know the word suicide, but they may not know what it means. So if we kind of, like with sex education, it's a whole other topic, sometimes they just get wrong information. So we want to make sure they're getting it right. So I'm not necessarily saying you have to name the word, but I think with younger kids, you can say things along like, you know, sometimes there's days where you just feel really sad, or sometimes there's days where you feel really mad. And, you know, what are things you can do when you feel that way? And putting in there, you know, mom and mom, or mom and dad, or dad and whatever the family combination is, are here for you when you're having those hard, you know, when you're having those hard times. I think you can put it in that language, and expressing also that it's important when you feel that way to not keep it to yourself, because it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And they usually do understand that. And I think you build upon that conversation as they get older. And again, these can be, I mean, they're my fun dinner table conversations, but these can be conversations that I've had. I found when parents, I mean, and obviously there's boundaries where you're not telling your kids everything about you per se, but I found sometimes when parents can share and role model, kids feel more comfortable doing it. Just even, I had a frustrating day at work, and so I needed to go take a walk by myself for 5 minutes to calm down, so I didn't yell at them. That kind of normalizes, oh, mom gets mad at people, mom wants to yell at people too, but here's what mom does. So a lot of those types of conversations.
Yeah, and I would
just
add one thing, and I like what you were talking about, just age appropriate words, and every kid's going to be different. But there was a study done over in Japan a few years ago, and that was for elementary age kids. And they thought that if somebody died, or if somebody died by suicide specifically, that it was like a video game where they would get to reset and they would get to start over. And so when you're talking about correcting some of what's out there, you know, it's issues like that we do need to talk about. And whether that means using the S word or not, or using, have you ever thought about not being here? Have you ever thought about ending your life? But I would agree with you 100% that kids know a lot more at far younger ages. And again, we've seen a lot of data coming out of the elementary schools that risk assessments have been increasing a lot for the last few years. So there's really definitely no too young of an age to talk about mental health, and then when and as needed to bring in the topic of suicide. And also your school is, again, a great resource. Reach out to your school counselors and say, hey, I'm kind of worried about my second grader. Can you help me talk to them? Because I'm worried that suicide might be part of this. And they, you know, that is their job. They're professionals. They can help walk you through that extremely well. I do want to just acknowledge this one question, Monica, if that's right. There's one that's asking about how come we're not talking about NAMI? NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It's not that we're not talking about NAMI. NAMI does amazing. They have chapters all over California. They run programs in school settings. They also have a tremendous program called Family to Family, which is where it's for the family members of individuals struggling with mental health issues. So it teaches you how to support them, how to respond to your own frustrations. It can be exhausting to support somebody going through a mental health challenge. And so understanding that, they have parents and teachers as allies. So I'm used to be a NAMI board member down in San Diego. So nothing but love for NAMI. If you're not familiar with them, please look up your local chapter and see what types of programs that they offer. But NAMI is a tremendous program. Thanks for mentioning that. A couple questions about this webinar in Spanish. We did the webinar in Spanish back in December, and we will be scheduling another parent webinar in Spanish sometime, I would guess, over the next month. So once we do, we will definitely be posting information out about that. So we've been getting a lot of requests for that and a lot of interest. Otherwise, let's see, some So teen support groups, somebody's asking about information on teen support groups. I don't know, Cheryl or Monica, if you have any information. I would probably start by contacting your school and see what's available locally, because it varies so much by area to area. There's also quite a few online teen support groups now, so that would be a way. I would just make sure if it's an online support group that you take time to really vet the organization, make sure that it really is a safe environment, that, you know, they have the right people in the room, and that all the information shared stays confidential, and that nothing gets recorded. Would just be a couple words of caution.
Right. I would just suggest that you check with your health providers. If you have insurance, that would be one of the first places I would visit. And the other suggestion would be there's a great resource, and I'll pop it into the chat. It's the California Alliance for Children and Family Services has a great interactive map of California, and you hover over any of those areas, and the little bubbles come up, and a lot of information comes up on the different resources that are in your area. So that's another place that I would start. And also NAMI. Check with your local NAMI affiliates about any of that information as well.
Okay. Another question came up about does this line have a texting option that she's heard from youth about getting stuck in a queue or waiting a long time. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline has really high standards for when a call is answered by. It's typically under 1 to 2 minutes at the maximum. I believe there's over 60 call centers around the state. We have 7 of them here in California. So wait times for a hotline here in California should be relatively low. And as far as crisis text line, in the times that I've used it or tested it out, I typically get a text back within 30 to 45 seconds, because there are literally thousands of volunteers working crisis text line. So I'm sorry that that was your experience. I guess the one kind of word of caution I would mention is that anytime I share a resource with youth or anybody, and really, I always call it first. I always check it out and say, hey, I'm just calling to check. And typically they're happy to answer your questions. They're happy to be vetted and that you're checking out the resource. And if they're not, then you maybe don't want to recommend that resource. But the National Lifeline, Crisis Text Line, Teen Line as well, all have really high standards for responding to individuals as quickly as possible.
Yep, there's a really good question. Does cutting lead to suicide?
I can take this one, Cheryl, and then.
Okay, I was going to say either way.
Okay. So we used to, when I first got involved in suicide prevention 20 years ago, we would say that cutting or self-harm is absolutely a warning sign for suicide. And then we started to really understand what self-harm was. And when you talk to a youth who self-harms, they will often tell you that they're trying to relieve pain, or they're trying to, they have so much pain inside that they want to externalize their pain. Sometimes they'll tell you that they're just trying to feel alive. So it's actually more of a self-medication or a coping mechanism. I would put it somewhere in the ballpark of, kind of like drug or alcohol abuse, that it has a place where people think that it helps them stay safe. The difference, though, is that or the similarity, I guess, would be that you also build resistance to it. So then you have to cut more, you have to cut deeper, you have to take more. And so someone who cuts or self-harm is not necessarily having thoughts of suicide, but they might be. Again, the only way you would know is if you ask them then. The one thing I would also mention about it is that what we have found is that a child who self-harms but does not have thoughts of suicide, if they develop thoughts of suicide, they will oftentimes move more quickly from thoughts to an attempt, because they have already broken down that barrier of self-harm and fear of harming themselves. And also that when a child stops self-harming, it's not necessarily a sign that they're safe. It might mean that that coping mechanism is no longer effective for them, and they might actually be in the greatest amount of danger. So don't just assume because a child is no longer self-harming that they're now safe. You want to talk to them about why, or maybe they just don't need it anymore. Maybe they're doing well, they found other coping mechanisms. But just a little bit, Cheryl, if you want to talk a little more on that, or did I do okay?
No, I mean, that was amazing. I think if you find out your kid is self-injuring, definitely taking it seriously, talking to them about it, getting them help and support, but not necessarily doing the jump in your mind that, oh my God, they need to go to the hospital and they're going to die tonight, all those sorts of things. Finding more about what role it's playing in their life And one of the things we do find with self-injury is it becomes an addictive behavior. And so we do want them to get, treatment so that it doesn't become a longstanding pattern that they have a hard time with throughout their life. But because it can just become it becomes a coping skill. We also don't want to take away that coping skill without another one in its place. So it's kind of like if you bit your nails, you wouldn't just stop biting your nails without doing something else. So finding some kind of replacement behavior that might work just as well. And we do see, particularly in this pandemic, I would say, we've seen a lot of teens start self-injuring or go back to it who maybe had recovered, but now life is so overwhelming that it might be coming up again. So it definitely is something to be talking about and be aware of.
Yeah, great. One question about Teen Line. I don't know if I can't answer this. So for you, Cheryl, can Teen Line ensure girl-to-girl conversations or same-gender conversations? Is that a request that someone can make?
Not necessarily. I would say most of our teens are female, just major mental. If you look at mental health in general, there's more females. All of our teens are trained the same way, and so they give the same kind of support. If a teen felt more comfortable talking to a girl about something, they could definitely ask for that. But it might be the scenario that might not be a girl available at that time. But I feel confident that all of our teens are trained the same way and comfortable with the same type of issues.
Okay. And also, if they asked, you would do everything you could to make that happen, of course, I would assume.
Yeah.
And also that some people are more comfortable talking to the opposite gender. Or, so
sometimes what we think our kids would want is the opposite. I will tell you, I had that with my daughter, that I just assumed at some point, if she was seeking a therapist, she'd want like a young, hip female. And she's, no, I think I'd want like a gay male. And I was, so it's interesting what they might want might be different than what we might want as well for them. And she had her own reasons for why she thought that was who she connects with the most. So just, bearing that in mind.
Another question is about the language of the film. So the Directing Change films, we have many in Spanish, a lot in English, obviously, but we actually allow films through the Lens of Culture category in any language. We have some films in ASL or American Sign Language. We have films in Hmong, Mandarin, Simple Chinese, all sorts of languages. So if you go to the Directing Change website, I'll go back over to that slide in a second. You can see those films as well. Let's see, looking through other questions, anything?
Something that stands out is, this is for you, Stan. Can schools request virtual presentations for students, mainly middle and high school? And if so, how can that request be made?
So just in general, how do schools request? Or was it specific to me, or just in general, how do they get training on suicide prevention?
I am thinking it's specific to Directing Change.
Okay,
I could be wrong.
No, you can contact myself. You can go to Directing Change. We have a submission form where you can ask for whatever. So we do, typically what we would do is find out what your school is already doing related to educating youth around suicide prevention and mental health. But we do a lot of Skype sessions with classrooms where we come in and we, both at the middle school and high school level, we have lesson plans around mental health, around suicide prevention. So it wouldn't necessarily be just a presentation. It would be coming in, a little bit of presentation, a little bit of activities, a little bit, a lot of learning. And then hopefully with the end result being that the kiddos wanting to participate and create films. So a ton of resources. So reach out to us through the website, directingchangeca.org, or I had my email up there for a while. Contact me and we'll absolutely get engaged with the school.
And I would say Teen Line as well. We're doing virtual presentations right now to schools or like religious groups anywhere where teens are. So if you reach out to me or through our website, we can come and talk to a group of students about, us as a resource. We're talking about things like healthy coping skills, stress and anxiety, LGBTQ, gender and sexuality. And we're not doing as much suicide in real life. We do a lot of suicide prevention with teens. In the Zoom world, we're doing it in a different sort of way because we can't always see teens. And so we can't always see who might be triggered or who might be struggling with the material and be able to provide them with resources after the fact. So we're tackling it in a different way, but we still are talking, we still are talking about it and making sure they know there's resources if they're struggling.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was news to me. It's great news to hear that Teen Line is doing those virtual courses. I have another question here, and it asks, is it possible for districts to introduce a class about mental health and how to help identify when their friends need help, how to reach out to adults for help? If sex ed is offered, isn't it time to have a mental health class? And if I can answer that, there's actually a bill that is being introduced now. I believe it's Senate Bill 224 that is asking for this exact requirement. They're asking for mental health instruction to be delivered once in the elementary school years. And before people, get upset about this, it would be age appropriate. So, we're not going to be or not we, but the school district is not going to be talking about things that are above their developmental level. So this would be offered once in the elementary school course, or not course, but once at the elementary school level, and once in the middle school level, and once at the high school level. So that bill will be heard during this legislative process at some point. So if you're interested in more information, you can contact me and I can send you a fact sheet and just additional information for you to review. I don't know if either of you have any comments on that.
That was perfect.
Okay. And just an FYI, school districts operate on a local level. And what does that mean? That means that, while the CDE is here to provide support and resources and activities and even funding, we do not dictate what school districts can do. That is all left at the local level. So if you're have an idea, if you're concerned about what your school district is doing, the state cannot dictate to the individual school districts. They are locally led.
Great. And what I wanted to do actually really quick, one of the questions was, could I give a little more information on the safety plan? So is it okay if I just want to share the safety plan template really quick and just kind of talk folks through what that is? Great. So on the screen, you should be seeing, it says patient safety plan. This is from, it's called the Barbara Stanley and Brown safety plan. And so this is the paper document. So this is what mental health professionals have been using for a while. Again, that My3 app takes all this information into the app. And so you would enter all of that into the phone. And what's great about that then is you can click a button to email that out to someone else. So you can email it to your parents, to your mental health professional. But it starts here with, what are my warning signs? So when I start to have negative thoughts, what are some of the things that I do? Again, this is self-regulation, self-recognition. So for me, I start to isolate. I start to blow off text messages and phone calls. I get really tired. What are some of the coping strategies? Maybe it's rest, maybe it's exercise, maybe it's playing music, maybe it's breathing or journaling. From there, if the thoughts of suicide are still present or the negative thoughts are still there, what are some people or social settings that can provide a distraction? So again, these are people not necessarily that you're going to go talk to about mental health or suicide, but just someone to get your mind off things, like Cheryl was talking about Among Us or video games or whatever that may be, just to kind of break the broken record in your head, or maybe a place, a safe place, a park or something where there's no danger involved with it. Okay, that's still not working. Who are some people in my life that I can identify that I think I can trust with this information that I'm having these thoughts? So those are the My3. So those are the people you actually integrate their contact into the phone. And then of course, crisis resources. And then as part of all of this is what we call means safety. So making the environment safe, getting weapons, especially firearms or knives, pills out of the home. So that is what a safety plan is at its core. And that is what you would find when you log into the My3 app. So just wanted
and we
to share.
do that. I was going to say on Teen Line, the teen might do that with another teen as part of the phone conversation, and then definitely do that on the Lifeline as well, coming up with them on the, on themselves. And like I said, when it feels safe and appropriate, we do encourage parents being on that safety plan as a, as a resource as well. Another app that teens have been liking was actually created by a teen as well. It's called Not Okay app, NOT and then okay. And so that's another one that teens seem to be liking as well, that helps, if they're struggling, of different ideas of what they can do.
Great.
Yeah, and then a couple other questions. So that the website for the app is My3 app. If you go into Android or iPhone iStore to find it, it's just My3. So My3 app is the website. If you just type My3, that's what that is.
There's another good question on here. It says, should I worry if my daughter talks with her therapist instead of me, her mom?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of talked about that one a little bit. I mean, ideally, yes, I would love her to be talking to you. I feel the same way about my daughter. But I think being happy she's talking to someone. And again, therapists there's a degree of confidentiality where it's not appropriate for the therapist to be telling you everything of what your teen has told them, because we want it to be our teen's safe space. But there also is a mandate for therapists as well that if your teen is in danger, they will let you know. And so that's something that's important to remember and keep that trust and faith. A lot of the times the therapist may work with the teen to talk to you more, because the idea is that therapy might not be forever. Let's set her up with some tools that she can use to extend into her life, and what can she do when she doesn't meet with this person anymore. So like I said, as hard as it can be, and I hear you as a parent, it really hurts, but I think we shouldn't be worried if she's talking to someone, and put trust and faith in the therapist that they will come to you if there's a reason to come to you.
Mm-hmm. Cheryl, this question's for you. To access the Teen Talk hotline, does the teen attending the call need consent from the parents? Do the parents get notified of the call from their child to the Teen Talk hotline?
No, so it's anonymous and relatively confidential. There are times where we will need to break confidentiality if someone's in danger, but no, we don't require permission. A lot of our contacts, particularly in the pandemic, are teens who just aren't in safe places. We've heard a lot about child abuse and unsafe environments. And so we would never want to separate, make it so the teen who was in danger couldn't reach out to us. Great,
thank you.
I got one here, Monica, about how do we help a person that has lost a loved one to suicide? It's a great question, and it's one of those where it's kind of interesting because we almost feel like we should do something different than if they died in a car accident or if they died from an illness, but really we want to do a lot of the same things. I would say one of the things that people seem to appreciate is when someone tells me a story about how they lost someone to suicide. The first thing I do is I ask their name. I ask what they were like. What was their favorite activity? What was their favorite snack? What was their favorite song? Because as a suicide loss survivor myself, so much of my memory of Jesse and so much of me, the opportunity I had to talk about him is the manner in which he died. That kind of ends up overtaking who he was in his life. So giving people the opportunity to experience and remember that person for who they were in life, what was the biggest favor they ever did for you? What was the funniest time you had for them? So that's one way. Also, most communities have some sort of survivor support loss group. Support groups aren't for anyone or aren't for everybody, but that they can be very helpful for some folks. There's a ton of resources online, but I think the most important one would be just to create space and try to help that person redefine who they were in their life, not just by their death. And you can go, I believe, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP.org. If you go to their website, you can, there's a button that says find a loss support group, and you can find one in your local community. So
Yeah, also AFSP has some other wonderful resources. They have the More Than Sad curriculum that they implement at different schools. And I just received information that this is going to be delivered virtually now. So they're ready to go virtual. So you can look them up, AFSP.
Another one about just improving care in hospital settings. It sounds like someone had a negative experience with their child in a hospital setting. I kind of hinted at this earlier that the hospital setting, unfortunately, there's amazing people who work in healthcare and psych nurses and such, but every experience is unique. And the reality is that most people don't need that level of intervention or that level of care, and it can inadvertently cause more trauma for that individual. The hospital setting is kind of more built around treating a specific mental illness, but not every youth who's having thoughts of suicide is dealing with a mental illness. So a lot of communities are in the process of creating strategic plans around suicide prevention. And a big part of that is what we call the crisis now model, which is providing a lot more options between the hospital and doing nothing. De-escalation units, crisis intervention teams, schools are creating a lot more safe spaces for youth. So I'm sorry that was your experience, but know that there's a lot of good people trying to change how that works.
I've been looking through some of the questions. I think something I was going to say, someone mentioned if a youth is participating in counseling and it doesn't seem to be helping, and that might be a time, maybe it's not a good fit, you know, and that's something Stan talked about before, that again, just because you might connect as a therapist or then might be referred as a great person might not be the right fit with your family. So that's something to definitely address. Also recognizing some behaviors take time to change, and a lot of teen behaviors occur in the context of a family as well. So sometimes as parents, we may need to be flexible or change around some of the way we interact with our children in order to see change. So those are just kind of some things to keep in mind. And if you have, you know, other teens, I mean, we all, especially most of us, are spending a lot of time together these days. But, you know, one child's behavior does impact the rest of the family. So if you find that, you know, that's the case, and seeking support. And a way to do it, I mean, family work is good as well, because that's a way sometimes to not stigmatize the one kid, is because it's easy sometimes to make one kid like they're the target, you know, they're the problem, they're this, they're that. How do we all work together more harmoniously as a family?
Great, thank you. There's a question on stats, and somebody said that they believe the stats you gave were from 2017, and their question is, any idea how the statistics have changed since the pandemic hit?
So unfortunately, that's a question we get a lot, and we're trying to get an answer to, but the reality is we don't have any impact data. Some counties, unfortunately, in 2019, nationally and locally, in most places, we had actually seen our first decrease in suicides in about 10 to 15 years, and then 2020 happened. So we don't have, unfortunately, and this frustrates a lot of people because we have obviously daily tracking on coronavirus deaths. Why don't we have the same on suicide? You know, that's a bigger question than we can get into, but typically the data around suicide lags anywhere from 2 to 4 years behind through the California Department of Public Health. And that's not a knock on them, that's just how the system works right now. Some local communities do a better job of tracking locally. Some have reported rises, some have reported decreases, but we can't say right now. What Monica and I often talk about as part of the Student Mental Health Policy Work Group is that the analogy that I would use is that through the pandemic, we felt the earthquake, but we are just now starting to feel the tsunami, which is that, you know, in the beginning, everybody was so worried that youth suicides were going to skyrocket, and we didn't see that. That wasn't the case. But after 9 months of stress and isolation, those coping mechanisms are starting to wear down, and unfortunately, we have been responding to what feels like a slightly increased number of suicides over the past few months, but I can't stamp that with any certifiable data.
Right, Stan, that's important for you to say that there is no certifiable data. I think that there is a lot of focus right now. And so when there is a suicide death, it seems like that is being, it's on the news and it's being shared on social media. So I think all the attention on those suicides is being magnified. So it appears that there is an increase, but there's no data that can substantiate that. And the sad part about this is also that we are always like 2 years behind in data. And so thank you for mentioning the Student Mental Health Policy Work Group and our Suicide Prevention Committee. We are trying to, come up with a way where we can collect data that is more accurate, to current times. So it would be great. Some of us have had the idea. It would be great if we could have a government agency that would collect the data. So in our idea, it would flow like from the district to the County Office of Education, the County Office of Education to a state agency, whether that would be the CDE or California Department of Public Health or Healthcare Services. That that's a different topic, and so we have a lot of things to figure out, because again, we can't require the school districts to report this data.
Yeah, great. So we're working on it. We're getting there, and hopefully sometime in the next few years. There's a lot of people at the state level that want to see that happen, and a big need at a national level for that to happen as well. One question I wanted to go back to and address really quickly, and tons of great questions, and I'm sorry we're not getting to every one of them. It says, how can we encourage a teen who needs support but they're reluctant or won't accept that it's being offered? How can we encourage them to participate? And one of the places I would encourage you to start with that reluctance is, why might a teen be reluctant to accept help or admit that something is wrong? There's a variety of reasons. One, they might think that they don't want to disappoint you. They don't want to admit, once we admit that something is wrong, now we have to do something about it. Youth will say that they feel like they've tried everything. So why would they accept your help? They've already done anything. What difference is it going to make? So there's a variety of reasons why someone will not accept help. Maybe the help that they've gotten in the past actually made things worse, or maybe they were traumatized by that. So I think a big part of it is being patient and trying to identify what may be the causes. Having some sympathy and empathy for that. And then to be, what I often say is to be creative and to also be gently persistent, to keep checking in, to keep trying new things, but really to try to bring it back to that hope. How can we bring hope back into the conversation? But Cheryl, you're the actual professional. So
yeah, I was going to say, sometimes with our teams, the more we want something, the less they want to do it too. So sometimes that's also backing off that. Yeah, backing off of it as well, because if they think they're doing it for us, then they might not want to do it as well. That's sometimes why peer resources are really good, because when it just feels like they're talking to a friend and they're not going to get someone. And I think sometimes it's watching our messaging. I'm not saying this is the case for the person who asked the question, but sometimes we'll be encouraging our kids to go talk to a counselor, but then in the other breath, bad mouthing someone who does talk about their feelings too much. So it's interesting sometimes the messages that people are getting, around that stuff. And sometimes we can figure out things in sly ways, like sometimes leaving things laying around or being a little sneaky for them as well. It's interesting what they will pick up. I saw this question. Are you answering the one about doing more harm than good, talking about I see Stan?
Yeah,
I think that's an important one.
Yeah, no,
okay.
I was going to type it, but go ahead. I think it'd be a good one for other folks to hear as well. So go ahead and jump in on it.
Yeah, I mean, we can go down the rabbit hole of like, what if the conversation goes here? What if the conversation goes here? What if the conversation goes here? I think if you're starting off well-intended and demystifying and just talking about it as a subject like you'd talk about other things, I don't think it's going to go the wrong way. I really do think there's such power in naming it and such talking about it, in putting yourself as a parent as a safe place for your child where they can come to you no matter what. That, just Stan called it the S word, that you're not scared of the S word. And if they were to come to you with that, you wouldn't fall apart, you wouldn't be shocked, you would know that this was happening. So I really don't think there is, that there is harm, it's good. I think the harm is when we don't talk about it, and then our kids or other people like suffer in silence, or they feel like they're the only person. That's the mind-blowing thing to me when we do teen presentations. Sometimes we'll have teen, this is better in real life than Zoom life, but close their eyes and raise their hand if they've ever, felt sad, or like just about different feelings. And it's amazing how many hands go up. But if you're feeling that way, you feel so alone sometimes too. So I think knowing that this is something that people struggle with, I don't want to say normalize it, but making it more of the conversation. And I think as Stan said, most of us, if we're honest, have thought of it. Maybe we've never been suicidal per se that we'd ever do anything about it. Most of us have probably had a moment in our lives where we thought, what would it be like if I wasn't here? Who would come to my funeral? All these thoughts. There is some, normal, I hate the word, but there is some normalcy to that as well. So destigmatizing it, taking the elephant out of the room, as I think someone else said. And that was a very long-winded answer. So Stan, you may have better insight.
No, that was great. I mean, I think, just jumping in the mud, and you're more qualified than you think you are. Of course, there's certain things you shouldn't say. Just the other day I was talking with a different webinar about avoiding cliches, avoid the things like time heals all wounds, and there's plenty of fish in the sea, or you're just a kid, anything that minimizes what they're going through. But if you're coming from a place of love and compassion and empathy, you're going to end up in the right place. And your kid's not going to get it perfect every time. You don't also have to get it perfect every time. But the danger is in, well, I'm so scared of not getting it right that I'm just not going to do it. So I'm just not going to create the space. And that's where it gets dangerous. So jump in there. I'm smiling because I love one of these comments in the Q&A.
I just saw that too.
Through playing a video game, GTA, it actually opened up space for her to have the conversation about death and suicide. So Tracy, way to be extremely creative and just find a way, whatever that is, that works for your child to get across that message. So I love that one. Another comment was about any information. This would be a great webinar to have about working with older adults. So many of you are concerned about your parents. That would be kind of out of the realm of the California Department of Education, but through Each Mind Matters, the website is, and I think I have it here, let me see, through Each Mind Matters, the Each Mind Matters Resource Center. I don't, but you can email me. We've conducted a number of webinars on supporting older adults, mental health and suicide prevention. So emmresourcecenter.org, you can go to get more information.
And I actually thought of, it's funny, I said there's nothing you could say that's wrong. I thought of a few things that we probably don't want to say in that conversation, which just includes judgment. Saying things like people who kill themselves are selfish or weak, or any of those kinds of things that imply judgment. And that's a much bigger conversation, and people are entitled to their views. But generally, people who die by suicide are in such a degree of pain, they don't see another way out. It's not about being selfish. Some of them will even call it the most selfless thing they've done, even if it doesn't feel that way as a survivor. But I think if we're saying something to our kids, like people who kill themselves are selfish or weak or crazy, that's really stigmatizing. And that's really saying you're not a safe person to come to if they ever felt that way, because then you'd be name calling or judging them as being weak or crazy. So those are probably some of the things I'd shy away from. But otherwise, I think, and I saw a comment, well, the one that made me smile is someone who just had an important conversation with her kid, which is amazing. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think demonstrating that you don't need, I think everyone plays a part in this. You don't need to be a mental health professional to play it, to play a part.
Yeah, great. I saw that as well. And just to put a little context to this, this person is listening to this webinar, and their child goes by and said, "Why are you listening to this?" And so, the parent takes that opportunity, right? They hadn't planned on talking about it, but this presented the best opportunity. So they had a hard conversation, is what they said. So thank you for taking time out of this webinar to go and do that real important stuff. There's another question here. How are resources being reverted to remote learning? I just mentioned the More Than Sad by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. That is usually delivered in person, but they are coming up, with the times and offering it in a virtual world. So that's one of the trainings I know about, as well as Youth Mental Health First Aid. We've also been used to delivering it in person, and we've moved onto the virtual platform as well. Cheryl and Stan, can you talk about any of the trainings that you're familiar with? I think, Cheryl, you did mention that you have trainings for students that are delivered virtually.
Yeah, we also do for educators and parents as well, similar trainings to these about suicide prevention or just understanding and how to communicating with your teen better. So that's all been adapted to the virtual format, which in some ways I would so much rather be in person with you all, but how many of you would never have been able to come if this weren't virtual? So we've had greater attendance than ever. We may not have the interaction that I love being in the same room, but we have so many more people who can be engaged and get this information. And I hope some of you are making dinners or doing other things while you're doing this, because that is, to me, the silver linings of some of this life.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to acknowledge too, and just one question before we get too far away I know we're going to have to shut down here in a second, but one of the questions was about if a teenager contacts one of the crisis lines, do the police get involved? And the goal of the crisis centers is to be able to de-escalate without any police involvement 99% of the time. The only time that they will engage police is if the person requests it and says, I don't feel safe, please send the police, or the person is in imminent danger, and then they will send the police. And depending on the community, oftentimes the police will respond in partnership with a mental health professional. In the ideal situation, we're seeing more and more of that. But that is really something that the crisis centers are really trying to let people know is calling us is not calling the police. We don't want to have to do an active rescue. You're calling us because you want to feel safe. We want to help you keep safe. And that's why we've also provided you with so many different sources, whether the National Lifeline, the Crisis Text Line, Teen Line, the Trevor Lifeline, Trans Lifeline is another one that's out there, so that you can find a place where you feel the safest. But whichever location you call, their goal is going to be to de-escalate and only really as necessary. Because I come from a family of law enforcement. Ultimately, they don't want to be responding to mental health calls. We don't want them to be responding to mental health calls. So the communities are really starting to see what are our other options for this. So.
And it's amazing because our teens do this too. We're the same. How good our teens are at just de-escalating a situation. A lot of the time, most of the time, we can de-escalate and give some hope. And a big word that it's funny we didn't use because it's usually one of my favorite words is empathy. I think that's a huge one when you're dealing with your kids or people in general. And I think that's provided a lot on these hotlines, of just some empathy of how hard it is to be you right now in this situation. And that sometimes someone getting them is empowering enough to kind of like overcome some of it and get to steps. Okay, how do I continue to feel better, or how do I get more support?
Great. All right. We are at our point where we need to close up, and I just want to thank Stan and Cheryl so much for all of their expertise, all the information and the resources that you've shared. This recording and the PowerPoint, along with a copy of the chat, will be emailed to all of the participants. If you are on Facebook and you would like a copy as well, please go ahead and email me. I have put my email in several of the responses. So we thank you once again. We can't say it enough times. Talk to your children, be open, practice in the mirror if you need to do that, right? Asking that question, right? Because it makes a lot of us nervous. How do we talk about it? How do we bring it up without, thinking that we're going to plant a seed in their head? There's all the research says that is not the case if we bring it up and start talking to them. And by all means, if somebody mentions to you, even if it's just in jest, if it's lightly, that they don't want to be here anymore, that this is too hard, that take them seriously and get help, reach out for help. I have made my email and contact information available to all of you. So if you have any, specific questions, please reach out. Stan?
Yeah, I just want to close out by saying, those of us who presented tonight are used to spending this much time talking about heavy topics like mental health and suicide prevention. So many of the questions involved stories of loss in the past. For many of you, this is the first time maybe you've ever talked in a public setting about suicide. So just take a moment and acknowledge that and breathe with it and sit with it. And unless you need to step into action and have a conversation with somebody tonight, I'm going to go ahead and recommend that you stop thinking about suicide for the night, step away from this, go do some self-care, whatever that is. If the weather's all right, go for a walk or bubble bath or whatever it is to you, to kind of step away from this, because this is our world, but it's not necessarily yours. And just take a breath. And I just so thankful that y'all joined us tonight. Hopefully a lot of great comments and questions. So just so wonderful to have you all here tonight. So thank you.
Stan, you beat me to the punch again. I was going to tell everybody to practice self-care because there's a lot of heavy stuff. Thank you so much. Cheryl, any last thoughts?
I was just going to say a huge thank you to our ASL interpreters as well, because I know it's not easy keeping up with the three of us, but huge props and echoing that slide at the beginning with the 5, 15, and 30 minutes. Remember that slide and do that now. And thanks again for being here.
Yeah.
And Monica for this opportunity to have us here.
Absolutely. Thank you to our presenters, the interpreters, and the wonderful TSD team at CDE. We hope to have you participate in one of our upcoming webinars. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.